Dad, there was another friend that Dad had, an Aboriginal called Moses, and he used to come to the island and he befriended Dad and Dad befriended him, and he showed my dad the best places to set a net in a little creek. There's a little creek like this. It's not shown on this map, but it comes across here. You see it on this big map here.
So it might have been a little creek.
It's called Mangrove Creek. Here, wait, I'll get my glasses. This is a wonderful map. I send copies of the guts of it to people who would acquire. That's right, here's Mangrove Creek, starting in Moscheto Creek, just west of Charles Cruise's land.
Yep.
This is a reserve. It goes in here and it just meanders into sort of swamps.
Yep.
Because Top Camp was here in Melmoth, and they used to step across it on logs laid across, and it meanders out and it becomes Mangrove Creek here, but because of Tongue it was always known as Tongue's Creek and Tongue's Tree. So
you mentioned Moses.
Moses showed Dad the places, and this is one of the places Dad used to put a net across to get fish, because the fish, the tides, Borrelia records, for example, how swift the tides are, and we felt it here in this creek. The tides rush in, and it's very fierce, and it flows in here and in here, and it's really fast.
Yeah.
And the dolphins would come leaping up. We've seen the dolphins leap up. We lost 2 dogs in here and one up here at Mayfield West from sharks. So Moses showed Dad all these things, and they became very good friends, and he used to bring his wife. I can remember it very clearly in the 1940s. He'd come and sit and have morning tea with Mum and Dad, and then Dad and he'd sit at the wood heap. We had a wood heap just where our wharf was, and they'd sit and yarn, and of course I'd sit near with, naturally.
So where did Moses and his wife live? Did they live on the island?
No, I don't exactly know where Moses lived. I think it was Mayfield, but the other thing that I know, I think I know, and I can't say this is true, that they came from Karua way, and they might have had something to do with the Karua Reserve. And I'm hoping to find out more, because I know her surname, Melmoth. But so Dad's sitting and talking with him, and he said one day, Moses, Moe, what do they call you Moses for? Were you born in the bulrushes? From the Bible, you see. And he says, no, Norm, I was born in the mangroves. And they're laughing, you know. And Dad laughs and he says, big-hearted people, aren't we? We take your country from you and give you 100 feet back. I always wondered what they meant, but I remembered it, and I found out when I went to the Mitchell Library, and I've got a map in there, and it shows you all around here, starting here just after Dempsey Island, about here, and it's dotted around. 100-foot reservation right along onto Moscheto Island, and that was the reservation and the only way I got alert to it was when I found an 1893 article in the Newcastle Herald after the 1893 floods. They sent a journalist over, and he did a wonderful report, and he mentions this reservation, gazetted in the old gazettes. Well, I scanned gazettes over there, thousands and thousands of pages, but I've never traced it. But I accept that, and I know that's what Ab and Dad and Moses were talking about.
A visitor to
they could fish.
Island?
The Aborigines could fish in there and live on the island. We know some of them did live on Ash Island, and the town's daughters remembered their grandma administering first aid to some Aboriginal who lived on Dempsey Island in the 1920s. And I've only ever found one reference that there were Aborigines in the 1860s on Moscheto, but no names. But with Ash Island it's a bit different. Ludwig Leichhardt visited Alexander Walker Scott in 1842, and he sails up and he marks in his diary that he passed Moscheto Island, incidentally spelt by the insect spelling,
Yeah.
Moscheto. And Dr. Roderick, who wrote a famous book called The Dauntless Explorer about Ludwig Leichhardt, has an asterisk beside the Moscheto. He quotes mosquito, has an asterisk, and at the footnote the asterisk says, now more elegantly spelt Moscheto. So I just laughed when I read that, because we were Mozzie Islanders or Skeeto Islanders, you know, we lived it.
And so there was a lot of fresh water, like was the fishing?
Well, the fishing was saltwater.
Saltwater,
But
and the
you
oysters,
could we sunk a well at the paddock at the back of our house during the war, because there was a 6 years drought from 1939 to 1945 along the east coast, and we only had one tank and no money to buy another one, so we had to harness our drinking water, and we used the brackish water to water the garden and to wash. And
so how did you harness your drinking water? Was it a ball? How did you harness drinking water? Just through
the water ran off the roof of your house, the spouting into your tank. Rain water is beautiful. It's so beautiful to wash your hair with. There are no chemicals in it. It's unbelievable how soft your hair comes up if you can get rainwater.
So where were the oysters when, like, your dad used to sell the oysters?
Yeah, well, that he used to when he married Mother, he was working in the coke ovens. He worked for 5 years, Mother tells me. But in 1927 he was burned. I have a sketch in there that he did me, a very rough sketch of what the old coke ovens were like. And it was very harsh work. The men wore wooden clogs. They hand forked the coke as it was pushed from the ovens onto the apron, as they called it, and they quenched it with handheld hoses, and the steam rose up. And eventually better coke ovens were installed, but people don't realise how dangerous and hot the work is in a steelworks. It's hot and dangerous work.
And I think there were a lot of injuries and deaths.
Yes. So my father went over on one of the company's tours with me, and when he saw the new coke ovens, he just was amazed. It's so different to my day. But then one of my sister's sons, Chris, he worked there during the Fraser recession. He couldn't get work as a bricklayer and a landscape gardener, so he went to the steelworks and they put him on the coke ovens. And he worked there a number of months, and I said, Chrissy, do you realise you're the third member of our family who's worked on the coke ovens? He said, no, I didn't, Auntie Vera, but they did say to me when I got a job in my trade that I could come back any time. I said, yeah, because they often couldn't get men who wanted to stay long enough, even in modern times. Because I was telling him about what Dad told me, and he said, well, when things broke down, they'd have troubles. There was a Larry car goes across the top, and there's the lid man. It takes the lid off. You know what a fuel stove's like? It's got a little lid where you load the coal in. Well, they have probably a bigger version of it, and the Larry car comes across and they drop coal into it. Well, when things broke down, he said we had to get up and do that manually. So yeah, that's what they cope with.
So after your dad had his accident...
Well, he got some compensation and he healed, and they decided they'd try and run a fish and chip business in Station Street, Waratah. And couldn't make a go of it because they couldn't meet the council's demands for equipment to install it and all that. So it faded. And by 1928 they went to live on Dempsey Island in a little house up here. It's marked on that. It was the first time, and it was very lonely, and eventually they came down here next to Muncaster's farm where John Baker first settled. So there's a long story about that.
And so he used to do the fishing trips, take people?
Well, he had, no, that came later in 1939, 1940. That's later on. That's 1928.
And so would people pay him for, like, just to be transported to different areas for fishing?
No, we're at 1928. So it's very lonely there, and Dad was working then at the at Merriweather, where the sewage, as a sewage worker. On the slopes, sewage worker. I still haven't worked out how he managed to get all that way to work, but I said to Mother one day, Mum, I can see me standing on the riverbank and looking down in the creek, and there's a launch coming up. She said, oh, you were 2 then? Ronnie was, my brother, was born when I was 2. He was born on the 9th of July and I was born on the 19th. And she said, we moved there when he was born, and you're seeing the cruisers launch come down. This is cruisers here, and they had a lot, and they came down here to go down to Newcastle. And she said, I was very lucky because one night your father didn't come home from work and I was really worried. I couldn't understand why he didn't come, and no telephones. So she said, I knew the cruisers would be coming down. She waited on the bank and hailed them. And Rebecca Cruise, Charlie or Dutchie Cruise's wife, he was the descendant of the original Charles Cruise. Rebecca said, don't worry, Nell, we'll inquire at the police station, see if they know anything. They go to the police, they said no, they had no record. Go and ask at the hospital, he might have had an accident. Go to the hospital and they find he's in hospital, he'd had a ruptured appendix and they had to operate on him. And there was no way they could contact the island, there was no phone.
No.
So when Dad got better, we moved out of that house and came here. And that was then about 1930, because that was the year Norman was born, the next child.
And so that was easier to get directly
Yeah,
across
well,
the
it was
river.
easy. You could come across here, and they had a wharf, and you came down here, and Spit Island had a long sandy bar at low tide. The water would ripple over it and then the sand would show, and then with the tide coming in it would disappear, but launches couldn't go across. They had to go right down to the gashometers and then turn up to the Black Wharf here at Ingall Street.
Okay.
And that's where we tied up our boats and launches, and the milk truck came to take the milk, and we came across to school. When Moscheto Island School closed, we went to Mayfield East School.
Yes, yeah.
And
so just getting places was quite difficult. Living on the island, like transport was difficult.
We were islanders. That was your way of
it was
life.
Part of your lifestyle.
And you have to realise that the river is your mother. It's your music. It's your inspiration. You have a bond. It's a mysterious bond. I don't care what people say. I'm not a poet, but the river definitely sings to you. It sort of insinuates little feelings that just come from being so close to it. There's no other way to look at it. And it fed us, helped to feed us, it transported us. You learned to row a boat, and that was one of the skills, and you took pride in learning it and besting the waves, good, bad or other. It was just accepted.
And
I feel
stories.
safer on a river than I do on a road with a motor car.
Yeah.
And you know you can drown in a minute, but that was just accepted.
Yes.
Because the islanders, that's one of the reasons they went there, because the soil was so rich.
Yeah, that they could grow their
Yeah,
own
you see all
food.
the allotments,
Yeah.
because Newcastle's soil was very poor, not good for growing.
Sandy, yeah.
And John Baker, who came there in 1830, he was an indentured gardener for the Australian Agricultural Company, and he was out of work. After the Napoleonic Wars ended, there was the usual thing happened, inflation, unemployment. You couldn't get work. They don't learn much. We suffer the same thing, war after war. So he saw an advertisement advertising for people to go to be employed by the Australian Agricultural Company out at Caribbean on Nelson Bay. That's where they established the first grant. They got 1 million acres, and Robert Dawson was the first. So what happened, Diana and John Baker left their village. It's written up in the Stockton History Journal, a lot of this. And he put in, he had very good references because he'd worked on some wonderful estates who grew fruit, and he was a good gardener, and he got the job, and they employed him as an indentured servant at £30 a year. And he came out on the Frederick with the accountant, who was employed at £500 a year, and he was William Barton, and he turned out to be the father of Edmund Barton, the first Prime Minister of Australia.
Amazing. He was
and
married in
also he
Newcastle.
bought land on Moscheto Island, 50 acres, and he left it to his son, Edmund Barton.
It's amazing.
Well, I fastened onto it, and I knew I couldn't prove it for years, but then
you did.
we found out there was a court case over the land. The banks were trying to do a dirty with him, and it's all there recorded in the Herald,
Wow.
the Sydney Morning
So
Herald.
was that the island where there was the early Botanic Gardens?
Hmm?
The early Botanic Gardens?
Oh no, this is the Botanic Gardens. Here it is, where Mayfield East School is. You know Crabbit
In
Street and
here.
Ingall Street?
In here.
There it is. There's the school, reserve, and it was dedicated in May 1868. But BHP got it.
Mm.
That's a very, very complex story there, but they got what they wanted. And there was quite a bit of an argument about it. I've gone into that a bit. So Dad was working, but it was only when hard times came that he took to the river, and it helped. The river fed us during the dull days.
Yeah.
And I can remember when I was about 5, or 1931, and I used to run around with my little brother, Ronnie. Norman was a baby. Dad had caught a lot of mullet and fish, and he made himself a smokehouse on the riverbank in front of this little tiny house we had on Dempsey Island. And he gets it going, and he's got all these fish that he's caught, and he got the smoke going, and he opens the fish up, and they're full of tar. That's told in Marilla's
Actually,
story.
I've read it, in Heck.
And he opened them up, and they were full of tar, and he was really upset. He looked across at the works, and he said, "They're killing the river." I've never forgotten it. And it's right, they treated the river as a sewer.
So that was in the 1920s?
That would be 1931. I was 5 then.
Yeah.
And it,
So that was like one of the early warning signs.
Oh,
of
well,
sort of seeing what was happening.
yeah, well, Ilma Felton, her father, George and Herbert Darwin Deemer, this was the top camp area of Moscheto Island. It was like a small village. And Ilma was born in Ties Hill, but she was brought back to Moscheto Island. All her sisters and brother were born on the island. But her father, he was what they call a specialist oysterman, and they used to dredge the North Channel here, and got all these oysters for the market. And in 1920, the steelworks had been going 5 years by then. He left because the pollution was seeping up here, the tides, and ruining the oysters. And he took his family from the island and came to the bluff here at Stockton, and moved into Tilligurry Creek, built himself a little prawning shed, and he prawned there. So you can see, and of course as the industries grew, you hear stories about, well, I met a woman up at the Spoonbill Cafe one day in the Hunter Wetlands, and we were talking about that, and she said, "Oh, I worked in Stuart Lloyd's office." And I said, "Do you ever remember seeing the slag trains going across to dump the slag into the river?" And she said, "Yes, I certainly do. And do you know what? We were not allowed to look out and see it. Now, why would they want to do that?" I said, "That's interesting." She was quite perturbed about it. She thought it was an infringement. She didn't say that, but she resented it. We were not supposed to. She naturally used to look when no one was looking. So they must have had a conscience. And I've got a fisherman's report done by the Newcastle, University of New England, and they tested the river, and all the chemicals and stuff were in there. They were using the river, and you know enough of BHP right up till they went out.
Yeah, so over decades you could just see Moscheto Island, like people moved off the island, it was taken over by industry.
Yeah, well, that was because 500 acres of the island, of the lower of Moscheto Island, were resumed in 1914 with a view to harbour improvement.
Yeah.
And that was because the steelworks was being built.
Yeah.
And they lost their ferry in 1924.
Yeah.
So, gradually, the school teacher of the time, Leslie Bedford, he did a census in about 1921. I've got a copy of that. There were still 156 people children depended on the ferry. And Taro Shire didn't have the money to keep it going. There was no government subsidy. Anyway, they lost the battle. They lost the ferry in February 1924. Plus the fact men could also get work in the works. So gradually the island declined. Yeah.
So the last people to have lived there would have been in the 1940s?
Yeah, well, we left from here. The depression had deepened, and Dad used to come and try and get work in between fishing, because I used to go with him. He'd hawk fish in a basket, 5 on a string for $1 around Mayfield, and then have ice around him and a white cloth. And he used to get very annoyed. Some fussy half-wife would poke, and he wouldn't sell them to her. He'd say, "What do you expect for a dinner, woman?" And he'd cover it over and march off with me in tow. He used to get, 5 fish for $1. I mean, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I heard, what's his name, our local balladeer here, Ken Jones, he talks about selling fish 5 for $5 later on during the war years.
So they were during the Depression years, so times are pretty tough.
Well, so we moved over to a little house here in Arthur Street, Pommytown, and we lived in that little house for a while, and that didn't work. He couldn't get enough work or money to pay the rent. So...
Do you remember the number? The
No,
number?
I don't remember. I see the houses, and there was a tank, and that's where I remember I lost a tooth. And I remember the fairies leaving me threepence in a glass on the tank stand. And there was a fire in one of the houses along. But every time I go back and see those houses, they're all very alike, those houses.
Now,